There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary, moments that you only recognize in retrospect as the precise second the world tilted on its axis. They are not loud, like the crack of thunder or the shattering of glass. They are quiet. They are the sound of a key turning in a lock for the last time, the soft sigh of a book closing, or the subtle shift of weight against your shoulder in a dimly lit room. For me, the world tilted on a Tuesday night in late October, under the weak, honey-colored glow of a single lamp, to the sound of another person's breathing slowing into the deep, rhythmic cadence of sleep. It was the moment Finn, my best friend, my roommate, the unwavering northern star of my small, carefully curated universe, fell asleep on me for the first time. And in that quiet, unassuming collapse, a boundary I had spent years meticulously constructing turned to dust. He hadn't meant for it to happen, of course. Intention was a language Finn rarely spoke when it came to his own emotional needs. He communicated in exhaustion, in kinetic energy finally spent, in the silent surrender of a body that had simply been pushed too far. He was a swimmer, a nationally ranked one, and his life was a relentless metronome of chlorine, lactic acid, and the unyielding pressure of the clock. That evening, he had returned from a grueling late-night practice, his movements slow, his broad shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to have settled deep into his bones. He had dropped his gear bag by the door with a heavy thud that echoed the finality of his energy reserves, and had collapsed onto the far end of our worn-out sofa, smelling faintly of pool chemicals and the crisp autumn air. I was on the other end, editing a series of photographs on my laptop, lost in the grayscale world of light and shadow that I so often preferred to the messy, unpredictable colors of real life. We didn't speak for a long time. Silence was a comfortable state for us, a shared space we had built together over 3 years of cohabitation. It wasn't an absence of words, but a presence of understanding. I knew his silences as well as I knew my own. There was the focused silence of pre-race concentration, the frustrated silence of a disappointing time trial, and the soft, contemplative silence that sometimes fell after a long day, when the world outside our small apartment faded away. This, however, was a different kind of quiet. It was the silence of depletion. I could feel it radiating from him, a low hum of exhaustion that seemed to absorb the ambient noise of the room. I risked a glance over the top of my screen. His eyes were closed, his dark hair, still damp at the tips, falling across his forehead. His long legs were stretched out, one foot dangling off the edge of the sofa cushion. He was a study in contained power, even in repose. The elegant lines of his swimmer's body, all long muscle and lean strength, were a cartographer's dream of disciplined anatomy. And I, the quiet observer, had spent years mapping every line of him in my mind. I had loved him, in some form or another, since the first week we were assigned as freshman roommates. It was a quiet, hopeless kind of love, the sort you quarantine in a remote corner of your heart, tending to it in secret while presenting a carefully maintained facade of uncomplicated friendship to the world. Finn was like sunlight, bright, warm, and effortlessly captivating. People were drawn to him, to his easy laugh and the genuine way he seemed to look at you when you spoke, as if you were the only person in the room. I was more like Shadow, content to exist at the edges, to watch and to document. My camera was my shield and my translator, the lens through which I could safely engage with a world that often felt too loud, too fast, too much. Finn had never made me feel like I was on the outside. He had simply pulled up a chair in my quiet corner and made himself at home, never questioning my silences, never demanding more than I was able to give. He was the one person who made me feel seen without the overwhelming pressure of being looked at. So I kept my love a secret, burying it deep under layers of shared jokes, late-night study sessions, and the easy, unassuming intimacy of two people who knew how to share a small space without friction. It was a secret I thought was safe, a truth I had locked away so securely that I sometimes managed to forget it myself. But on that October night, as the minutes stretched into an hour, the lock began to give. He shifted, a small, unconscious movement, a murmur escaping his lips as he turned his head. Then, slowly, incrementally, he began to list in my direction. It was like watching a great ship slowly taking on water, a gradual, inevitable lean. I froze, my fingers hovering over the trackpad of my laptop. Every nerve ending in my body went on high alert, cataloging the decreasing distance between us. 10 inches. 6. 3. My own breathing hitched, caught somewhere in my throat. I should have moved. I should have cleared my throat, shifted my position, done something to break the spell. It would have been the normal, friendly thing to do. But I was paralyzed, caught between the instinct for self-preservation, the desperate need to protect the fragile ecosystem of our friendship, and a profound, aching longing I had refused to acknowledge for years. And then his head came to rest on my shoulder. It was a gentle weight, surprisingly, so for someone so strong. His hair was soft against my cheek, and the scent of him, chlorine, clean laundry, and something uniquely Finn, filled my senses. His breathing, which had been shallow, deepened, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of profound sleep. The world narrowed to that single point of contact. The weight of his head on my shoulder, the warmth of his body seeping through the fabric of my t-shirt, the soft puff of his breath against my neck. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. This was a line. A beautiful, terrifying, unspoken line had just been crossed, and I had done nothing to stop it. I sat there, rigid and unmoving, for what felt like an eternity, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air between us. I carefully, slowly, closed the laptop, plunging the room into near darkness, save for the one warm lamp. I told myself it was for him, to let him sleep. But it was for me. I needed the darkness to hide in, to feel this impossible, fragile moment without the harsh judgment of the light. He had collapsed a boundary without even knowing it existed, and in the quiet rubble, I felt the first terrifying tremor of hope. To understand the magnitude of that tremor, you have to understand the foundation upon which it was built. Our friendship had always been a thing of quiet architecture, constructed with beams of mutual respect and walls of unspoken understanding. We met as randomly assigned roommates, two disparate elements thrown together by a university housing algorithm. I arrived first, a nervous 18-year-old photographer clutching a box of carefully cataloged darkroom chemicals, and had already staked out my territory with a minimalist precision that bordered on ascetic. My side of the room was a landscape of gray and black, my books stacked with geometric accuracy, my single-framed photograph, an abstract shot of light fracturing through a prism, hung perfectly parallel to the floor. I was building a fortress against the anticipated chaos of college life. Finn arrived 2 hours later like a controlled hurricane. He didn't so much enter the room as he did burst into it, trailing a scent of summer rain and carrying a duffel bag so large it seemed to have its own gravitational pull. He dropped it, grinned a grin that seemed to generate its own light source, and stuck out a hand. "Finn," he'd said, his voice warm and easy. "Looks like we're cellmates." His side of the room quickly became a vibrant, chaotic ecosystem of swim team hoodies, dog-eared paperback novels, and an ever-growing collection of mismatched mugs. Where I had structure, he had entropy. Where I had silence, he had a perpetual, low-humming soundtrack of indie rock. It should have been a disaster. By all logic, we were fundamentally incompatible, two different species forced to share a habitat. But it worked. It worked because Finn seemed to possess an innate understanding of personal geography. He never pushed into my space, physical or emotional. He seemed to sense the invisible lines I drew around myself and respected them without question. He learned to read my moods by the angle of my shoulders or the type of music leaking from my headphones. He discovered that my quietness wasn't a judgment or a sign of displeasure, but simply my native state. In return, I found myself slowly, cautiously, lowering my drawbridge. I learned that his boundless energy wasn't manic, but a manifestation of his passion, and that beneath the easygoing, athletic exterior was a mind that was sharp, curious, and surprisingly gentle. He would ask about my photography, not with the polite disinterest of most people, but with a genuine desire to understand what I saw in a sliver of light or the texture of a decaying leaf. He would sit for hours, watching me work in our makeshift darkroom in the bathroom, mesmerized by the ghost of an image slowly appearing on paper in the shallow tray of developer. My affection for him grew like a photograph developing in that darkroom. A slow, chemical reaction, an image emerging gradually from the ether, imperceptible at first, and then suddenly, undeniably there. It was in the small things. The way he'd bring me back a coffee without me having to ask, remembering exactly how I took it. The way he'd instinctively lower his voice when he saw I was concentrating. The way his eyes would find mine across a crowded room. A small, conspiratorial smile playing on his lips. A silent acknowledgement that we were a team, an island of two in a sea of strangers. I fell in love with him not in a single, dramatic moment, but in 1,000 tiny, paper-cut instances that accumulated over time until they became a single, deep, and unhealable wound of longing. I hid it, of course. I became a master of emotional camouflage. My friendship with him was the most precious thing I had, a safe harbor in a world that often felt overwhelming. To risk it for a feeling that was almost certainly unreciprocated felt like a form of madness. So I learned to compartmentalize. There was Finn, my friend, with whom I could share anything, except the one thing that mattered most. And then there was Finn, the object of my affection, who lived only in the quiet, unlit spaces of my mind, in the split-second shutter click of my gaze lingering a moment too long, in the carefully composed photographs I took of him when he wasn't looking, capturing not the athlete, but the unguarded boy, asleep with a book on his chest, or staring out the window at the falling snow. Those images were my only confessionals. He dated, of course, a string of bright, cheerful girls who seemed to fit so perfectly into the sunlit world he inhabited. I was always polite, always friendly, playing my role as the supportive best friend with an Academy-worthy performance of placid indifference. I listened to his stories about them, offered advice when asked, and felt a piece of myself quietly erode with every mention of a name that wasn't mine. The worst was a girl named Clara, a soccer player he dated for nearly a year. She was lovely, and she understood his world of athletic dedication. She saw the version of Finn that the world saw, the champion. But I always felt, with a certainty I could never prove, that she didn't see the rest of him. She didn't know the Finn who read poetry when he thought no one was watching, or the Finn who was quietly terrified of disappointing his father, or the Finn who could be rendered completely silent by the particular shade of the sky at dusk. I knew those Finns, and I jealously guarded my knowledge of them, a secret treasure that made the pain of my unrequited love both sharper and more bearable. When they broke up, in the spring of our junior year, it was Finn who sought me out. He didn't want to talk about it, not really. He just wanted to sit in our living room, the same living room where he would one day fall asleep on my shoulder and exist in a space that required nothing of him. We watched a terrible action movie, and halfway through, he said, his voice quiet. She never really got the quiet parts of me. It was the closest he ever came to explaining it. And in that moment, my heart swelled with a terrible, selfish hope that was so potent it almost choked me. I just nodded, my eyes fixed on the screen. I know, I said. And he knew that I did. That was the foundation. Years of shared space, of unspoken understanding, of a friendship so deep and comfortable that it had become the central pillar of my life. And on top of that foundation, I had built a secret, a love so carefully hidden that I believed it was undetectable. The weight of his head on my shoulder that October night was the first crack in the facade, the first sign that the structure I had so painstakingly built was about to come down. The shift, when it came, was not a sudden earthquake, but a slow, tectonic drift, a gradual changing of the emotional landscape that began long before that night on the couch. It started at the beginning of our senior year, with the NCAA championships looming on the horizon. This was supposed to be Finn's year. He was co-captain of the team, a favorite for the national title in his event, the culmination of a lifetime spent chasing the black line at the bottom of a pool. The pressure was immense, a physical weight I could see settling on his shoulders, tightening the muscles in his jaw. and stealing the easy light from his eyes. He trained with a ferocious, almost self-destructive intensity, pushing his body to its absolute limit and then beyond. He was chasing a dream, but it looked to me like he was being hunted by it. He grew quieter, more withdrawn. The vibrant energy that had once filled our apartment seemed to dim, the wattage turned down low. He still smiled, still laughed, but it often didn't reach his eyes. He was building walls of his own, not out of a need for solitude like mine, but out of exhaustion and fear. He started having trouble sleeping, a cruel irony for someone whose body was screaming for rest. I would hear him in the middle of the night, the soft creak of floorboards as he paced the living room, a restless phantom haunting our small space. Sometimes I'd get up, feigning a need for water, and find him staring out the window, his silhouette stark against the sodium vapor orange of the city at 3 a.m. I wouldn't press him. I'd just stand beside him, a silent sentinel, and we'd watch the world sleep, two insomniacs bound by a shared, unspoken disquiet. The catalyst, the event that finally fractured his carefully maintained composure, came in late September at a major invitational meet that was seen as a preview of the national championships. He was swimming against his biggest rival, a cocky, talented swimmer from a rival university. The tension in the natatorium was thick enough to taste, a humid brew of chlorine and anticipation. I was there, of course, perched high in the stands with my camera, my lens trained on him. From that distance, through the magnifying power of the glass, I could see the strain around his eyes, the forced nonchalance of his posture on the starting block. He looked like a statue of himself, a perfect marble replica of a champion, but I could see the fault lines, the tiny cracks threatening to shatter the illusion. The race was a blur of churning water and desperate, grasping limbs. It was agonizingly close. For 7.5 laps, they were perfectly matched, stroke for stroke, a beautiful and brutal aquatic duel. But on the final turn, something went wrong. Finn's timing was off by a fraction of a second. He pushed off the wall a hair too late, his streamlined form faltering for a microsecond. It was all his rival needed. Finn lost by 0.03 of a second. An eternity in his world. A blink of an eye in mine. I watched him through my lens as he hauled himself out of the pool. He didn't look at the scoreboard. He didn't have to. He knew. He ripped his cap off, his chest heaving, and for a moment, he just stood there, water sluicing from his body, his face a mask of utter devastation. It wasn't just disappointment. It was something deeper, a foundational belief in himself that had just been violently shaken. He had given everything, and it hadn't been enough. In that moment, he looked younger than I had ever seen him, stripped of his confidence, exposed and heartbreakingly vulnerable. I lowered my camera, feeling like a voyeur, my heart aching with a fierce, protective instinct that was painful in its intensity. He was quiet on the drive home, a profound, hollow silence that was worse than any shouting or tears. He stared out the passenger window, the passing streetlights striping his face, illuminating and then hiding the despair in his eyes. I didn't try to fill the silence with empty platitudes. He didn't need a cheerleader. He needed an anchor. So I just drove, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my presence a steady, unspoken promise that he was not alone in the dark. When we got back to the apartment, he went straight to his room and closed the door. The quiet click of the latch felt like a portcullis slamming down. That was the night the ritual began, though we didn't call it that. It had no name. It simply started. Around midnight, my own door, which I always kept slightly ajar, creaked open. I saw his shadow in the sliver of light from the hallway. He didn't speak. He just stood there for a long moment, a silent, indecisive silhouette. I held my breath, my heart starting a slow, heavy drumbeat. Then, he moved into the room. He was carrying his pillow, clutched to his chest like a shield. "Can't sleep," he whispered, his voice rough. My room was small, dominated by my bed and my desk. There was a worn armchair in the corner, but he didn't look at it. His eyes were on the sliver of empty space on my queen-sized mattress. A chasm of possibility and terror. "Okay," I whispered back, my own voice tight. I shifted over, pulling the comforter with me, creating an invitation I wasn't sure I was brave enough to extend. He didn't hesitate. He rounded the bed and slid under the covers, his back to me, keeping a careful, respectful distance between us. He lay there, perfectly still, a rigid line of tension in the darkness. We didn't speak. The only sounds were the hum of the city outside and the frantic, silent screaming of my own thoughts. I was acutely aware of him, of his warmth, of the sheer fact of his presence in my bed, a space that had always been exclusively mine. It was an intrusion of the most profound and welcome kind. After about 20 minutes, I felt the tension in his shoulders begin to release. His breathing deepened, losing its ragged edge. He was asleep, and I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, terrified to move, terrified to breathe, feeling like the guardian of his fragile peace. He had come to my room not for conversation, not for absolution, but for sanctuary. And I, the quiet observer, had become his harbor. That was the shift. The moment his need became greater than our unspoken rules. The night his door closed and mine, for the first time, opened. From that night forward, the ritual took on a life of its own, a silent script we both learned to follow without rehearsal. It wasn't every night, at first. It was sporadic, governed by the tides of his stress and exhaustion. After a particularly brutal practice, or a tense phone call with his hypercritical father, I would hear the soft footfalls in the hallway, see the familiar shadow appear in the crack of my open door. He never had to ask again. The first night had been the only permission he needed. He would slip into the room, a silent supplicant seeking refuge, and I would make space for him, a silent acolyte granting it. We became two celestial bodies caught in a new, strange orbit, my room the gravitational center that pulled him in from the cold, lonely vacuum of his own anxieties. The unspoken rules of this new arrangement were complex and delicate. We never spoke of it in the daylight. In the morning, he would be gone before I woke up, the only evidence of his presence a faint indentation on the pillow next to mine and the lingering scent of his skin in the air. We would meet in the kitchen, making coffee, talking about classes or practice, our conversation a masterclass in determined normalcy. It was as if a collective amnesia descended with the sunrise, erasing the intimacy of the night before. We were friends. We were roommates. Nothing more. But the nights told a different story. The nights were a space of exception, a pocket dimension where the rules of our friendship were suspended. My analysis of this new dynamic was relentless. My mind, so accustomed to observing and deconstructing the world through a lens, turned its full, unblinking focus inward and on us. I cataloged every detail with the precision of a forensic scientist. The distance he kept between us and the bed, initially a respectable foot of neutral territory, began to shrink over time, the inches eroding with a geological slowness. One night, I woke to find his hand, which in sleep had lost its conscious restraint, resting on the mattress just a whisper away from my own. I lay there for an hour, my gaze fixed on our hands in the dim light, a study in proximity and potential. The space between our fingers felt charged with a voltage that made the air hum. I fought the overwhelming urge to close that gap, to intertwine my fingers with his. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, the fall both terrifying and desperately tempting. I didn't move. I couldn't risk it. The ritual was too fragile, too precious to jeopardize with my own clumsy, explicit need. Then came the night on the couch, the one that had felt like the beginning but was, in reality, just another step in this slow, inexorable dance towards a destination I couldn't yet see. His collapse against my shoulder was different from the careful, intentional entries into my bed. It was an unconscious act of surrender, a homing instinct he wasn't even aware of. And after that night, the pretense of distance began to dissolve more quickly. The ritual in my bedroom changed. He no longer lay rigidly on his side, his back a defensive wall. He would turn to face me, the space between us now just a few inches of warm, shared air. We would lie there in the darkness, our breathing synchronized, two pendulums swinging in perfect time. Sometimes, in the deep of the night, he would shift, his knee brushing against mine, or an arm thrown carelessly across my waist in his sleep. Each accidental touch was a small explosion in the quiet landscape of my heart. I would lie awake, my body thrumming with a mixture of bliss and terror, memorizing the weight of his arm, the texture of his skin, the simple, profound fact of his closeness. This period was a strange kind of purgatory. It was both a comfort and a torment. I had more of him than I had ever dared to dream of, and yet I had nothing at all. This intimacy existed in a bubble of plausible deniability. He was just tired. He just couldn't sleep. He needed a friend. I was his safe space, his emotional charging station. Any romantic or physical interpretation was a projection of my own secret desires, a story I was telling myself. I turned this over and over in my mind, searching for clues, for definitive proof. I replayed his every word, every gesture, analyzing them for subtext, for a hint that he felt even a fraction of what I felt. I found nothing conclusive. His actions were a Rorschach test. I could see whatever I wanted to see in them. My photography began to change during this time. I had always been drawn to stillness, to landscapes and abstract forms. Now, I found myself obsessed with the human figure, with the subtle language of the body. I spent hours in the darkroom, developing portraits of strangers, focusing on the tension in a hand, the vulnerability of a closed eyelid, the curve of a neck. They were all proxies for him, of course. Every image was an attempt to understand the boy who lay beside me in the dark, so close and yet so infinitely far away. My art became an extension of my yearning, a way to process the beautiful, agonizing ambiguity of our new reality. The ritual was a sanctuary, but it was also a gilded cage. It held me captive in a state of perpetual, hopeful anxiety. I began to live for the nights. The days became a long, gray waiting period, a stretch of time to be endured until the possibility of his shadow in my doorway returned. My world, which I had once so carefully controlled, now revolved entirely around him, around his moods, his schedule, his unspoken needs. I was losing myself in him, my own boundaries dissolving into his. I knew it was dangerous, that I was setting myself up for a heartbreak of catastrophic proportions. But the pull was irresistible. He was a low, constant hum beneath the surface of my life, and the thought of returning to the silence before this began was unbearable. So I let the ritual continue, let the lines blur and the hope grow, because even the torment of uncertainty was better than the certainty of a life without this impossible, terrifying closeness. Each night was a prayer I didn't know how to speak, a silent plea for the ambiguity to finally resolve into something real, something named, something I could hold on to in the light of day. The crossing happened on a Sunday night in mid-November. The air had turned sharp and cold, and the first hints of a long winter were beginning to settle over the city. A storm had blown in, a furious assault of wind and freezing rain that rattled the windows of our apartment and seemed to seep into the very walls, making the world outside feel hostile and remote. Inside, we had built a small fortress of warmth and light. We had spent the day in a state of comfortable, quiet domesticity, studying on opposite ends of the sofa, a pot of chili simmering on the stove, the only sounds the turning of pages and the relentless drumming of rain against the glass. The storm had canceled Finn's evening practice, a rare and welcome reprieve that had left him untethered, with a block of empty time he didn't quite know how to fill. He was restless, a low-grade anxiety humming just beneath his skin, the absence of his usual physical exhaustion leaving his mind too much space to wander into dark places. As night fell, the restlessness grew. We ate dinner, watched a movie, but he couldn't seem to settle. He paced the living room, stared out the window at the slick, black streets, his reflection a pale ghost superimposed over the storm-tossed world outside. I watched him, my heart aching with a familiar helplessness. I could offer him my silence, my space, my bed, but I couldn't fight the demons inside his head. That was a battle he had to wage alone. Finally, around 10 o'clock, he stopped pacing and came to stand in front of me where I sat on the floor, leaning against the sofa. He looked down at me, his eyes dark and unreadable in the dim light. The air between us was suddenly thick with an unspoken question. "Can we just go to bed?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't a request for sleep. It was a request to escape, to shut down the noise, to retreat to the one place where he seemed to find a measure of peace. I just nodded, and we went to my room. The ritual began as it always did. We undressed in the near darkness, a practiced, modest choreography, and slid under the covers. But tonight felt different. The storm outside seemed to have compressed the atmosphere inside, making the small space of my room feel even more intimate, more isolated from the rest of the world. He didn't turn his back to me. He lay on his side, facing me, his body closer than it had ever been before. I could feel the heat radiating from him, could see the faint rise and fall of his chest with each breath. We lay like that for a long time, silent, the only sound the howling of the wind. I thought he had fallen asleep, but then he spoke, his voice so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it. "Leo." "Yeah." My voice was a dry rasp. He was quiet for another long moment. I could feel him gathering his courage, wrestling with a thought that terrified him. I waited, my entire being focused on him, on the words that were hovering in the space between us. "Why are you so good to me?" he asked. The question was so raw, so vulnerable. It felt like a physical blow. It was laced with a genuine confusion, as if my steadfast presence in his life was a kindness he couldn't comprehend, a gift he didn't believe he deserved. My heart fractured. All the things I wanted to say, the library of unspoken volumes I had written about him in my mind, swirled in the silence. "Because I love you. Because you are the sun and the moon. Because breathing is easier when you're near." But those were not words I was allowed to speak. They belonged to a world we did not inhabit. So I chose the simplest, most honest truth I could offer. "Because you're my best friend, Finn," I said softly. "Because you do the same for me." He let out a shaky breath, a sound that was half sigh, half sob. He shifted closer, the small distance between us vanishing completely. His forehead came to rest against mine. His skin was cool. I could feel the slight tremor running through his body. We stayed like that, breathing each other's air, our eyes closed, two souls huddled together for warmth against an internal storm that was far more violent than the one raging outside. This was a new territory, a level of intimacy that surpassed the physical. This was vulnerability. This was trust. His hand came up, his fingers gently tracing the line of my jaw. His touch was feather-light, tentative, a question asked without words. My eyes fluttered open. His were already open, inches from mine, and in their depths I saw a maelstrom of emotions, fear, confusion, and a startling, undeniable flicker of the same desperate longing that lived inside of me. The carefully constructed walls of our friendship, the years of plausible deniability, were dissolving in that single, shared gaze. His eyes dropped to my lips. Time seemed to slow down, each second stretching into an eternity. The world narrowed to the space between our mouths. This was it. The precipice. The point of no return. "Would it be okay?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The question shattered me. Not "can I," but "would it be okay?" It was a question of permission, of consent, of a profound and gentle respect for the boundaries he was about to obliterate. He was giving me an out. He was giving me the choice to preserve the safety of what we were, to retreat from this terrifying, beautiful cliff edge. And in that moment, I knew I would rather fall than spend another day living in the safe, gray world of before. I didn't answer with words. I couldn't. I simply closed the final, infinitesimal distance between us and pressed my lips to his. It was not a kiss of passion or of frantic, pent-up desire. It was a kiss of quiet discovery. It was soft and hesitant and deeply, profoundly gentle. It tasted of salt and rain and a sorrow so deep it felt ancient. It was a confession. It was an apology. It was a question and an answer all at once. His lips were softer than I had imagined. His hand moved from my jaw to the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair, holding me there, not with force, but with a kind of desperate reverence, as if he was afraid I might disappear. I brought my own hand up to cup his cheek, my thumb stroking the damp skin. It was a kiss that lasted only a few seconds, but it redrew the map of my entire world. When we finally pulled away, We didn't speak. We just rested our foreheads together again, our eyes closed, breathing. The storm outside still raged, but inside my small room, in the aftermath of that quiet, cataclysmic kiss, there was a profound and unnerving silence. The line had been crossed, and neither of us had any idea what lay on the other side. The aftermath was not the explosion I had feared, but an implosion. It was a quiet, suffocating collapse inward. The morning after the kiss, the familiar amnesia of the daylight hours returned, but this time it was different. It was not a comfortable, unspoken agreement to forget. It was a tense, deliberate act of avoidance. When I woke up, he was already gone, not just from my bed but from the apartment entirely. A note was on the kitchen counter, his familiar scrawl looking alien and strained. Early practice. See you later. There was no warmth in it, no easy familiarity. It was a communique from a stranger. The day was excruciating. I went to my classes. I tried to work in the darkroom, but my mind was a static-filled radio, unable to tune into anything but the memory of the night before. The ghost of his lips was on mine, the phantom weight of his hand on my neck. I replayed the kiss 1,000 times, analyzing it from every angle, searching for meaning. Was it a mistake? A moment of weakness brought on by the storm and his emotional turmoil? Or was it what I desperately wanted it to be? A confession, a beginning? The silence from him was a breeding ground for my deepest insecurities. The hope that had bloomed so tentatively in the darkness began to wither under the harsh, uncertain light of day. When he finally returned that evening, he was a different person. He was encased in a shell of forced cheerfulness, a brittle armor that I could see right through. He talked about practice, about a paper he had to write, about anything and everything except what was hanging in the air between us, a massive, invisible object we were both carefully maneuvering around. He didn't meet my eyes. He kept himself in motion, tidying the kitchen, sorting his mail, creating a buffer of activity that prevented any possibility of stillness, of conversation, of connection. He was a stranger in our own home. And that night, for the first time in weeks, he did not come to my room. His door, which had been a gateway to our secret world, remained firmly, unequivocally closed. The silence from his side of the apartment was a deafening roar. I lay in my bed, in the vast, empty space he had once occupied, and felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter night. I had been given a glimpse of a world I had only ever dreamed of, and then the door had been slammed shut in my face. The pain of it was a physical thing, a hollow ache in my chest that made it hard to breathe. The ambiguity of the ritual had been agonizing, but this clear, deliberate withdrawal was infinitely worse. This pattern continued for 3 days. 3 days of polite, superficial conversations. 3 days of him avoiding my gaze. 3 nights of his closed door. I felt myself starting to fracture. The quiet observer in me was screaming, my patience worn down to a raw nerve. I had spent years protecting our friendship, prioritizing his comfort over my own needs, but the kiss had changed the equation. He had initiated it. He had crossed the line, and now he was pretending it had never happened, leaving me alone in the wreckage. The hurt began to curdle into a quiet, simmering anger. An anger at him for his cowardice, and an anger at myself for allowing my happiness to become so completely dependent on him. On the 4th night, I couldn't take it anymore. I knew that if I didn't do something, this silence would calcify, would become the new, unbearable foundation of our relationship, and we would be lost for good. I found him in the living room, staring at a blank television screen, the remote held loosely in his hand. He looked exhausted, haunted. The forced cheerfulness was gone, replaced by a profound, weary sadness. I stood in the doorway for a moment, gathering my courage. My heart was pounding, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. Finn, he flinched at the sound of his name, but he didn't turn around. Hey, he mumbled at the screen. I walked into the room and turned off the television. The sudden silence was absolute. I sat down in the armchair across from him, creating a space for confrontation, not comfort. He still wouldn't look at me. He just stared at the dark screen, at his own faint reflection. We need to talk about it, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes broke my heart all over again. It was pure, unadulterated fear. He looked like a cornered animal. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice weak. "Don't," I said, and the word was sharper than I intended. "Please, don't do that. Don't pretend it didn't happen. You kissed me, Finn, and now you're acting like I don't exist. You owe me more than that. I deserve more than that." He flinched as if I'd struck him. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "I can't, Leo," he whispered, his voice muffled. "I can't do this." "Can't do what?" I pressed, my voice softening despite my anger. "Can't talk to me? Can't tell me what's going on in your head? After everything, you can't give me that." He looked up, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm so screwed up," he said, his voice cracking. "What I did, it wasn't fair to you. I was a mess, and I used you. I took advantage of how good you are. It was a mistake, a mistake." The word landed like a stone in my gut. Every fear, every insecurity I had, confirmed in a single, devastating word. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had prepared for confusion, for fear, but not for this. Not for a complete and utter negation of the moment that had felt so real, so true. "A mistake," I repeated, my own voice hollow. "Was it a mistake when you came to my room every night? Was it a mistake when you fell asleep on my shoulder? Was it a mistake when you asked me if it was okay? Which part was the mistake, Finn? The part where you needed me, or the part where you might actually feel something for me?" He recoiled, his face pale. "That's not it," he stammered. I don't know what I am. I don't know what I feel. All I know is that I'm drowning, Leo. The pressure from my dad, from swimming. I feel like I'm going to fail at everything. And you're the one good, solid thing in my life. You're my best friend. I can't lose that. I can't risk you. Kissing you, it felt like I was breaking the only thing that was holding me together, and there it was. The confession, wrapped in layers of fear and self-loathing. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified. He was terrified of what he felt, of what it meant for his carefully constructed identity, of what it could do to the one relationship that felt safe. He was pushing me away not because he didn't care, but because he cared too much. He was trying to protect our friendship, to put things back in the box they had been in before, not realizing that the box had already been shattered. I took a deep breath, the anger draining out of me, replaced by a vast, aching tenderness. I saw him not as the source of my pain, but as someone who was in a pain far greater than my own. I got up from the chair and knelt on the floor in front of him, closing the distance he had tried so hard to create. I gently took his hands, pulling them away from his face. His fingers were cold. "Finn, look at me," I said softly. He reluctantly met my gaze. "You're not breaking me. You could never break me. But this silence, this avoidance, that is breaking me. That is breaking us. Do you think our friendship is so fragile that it can't handle this? Do you think I'm so fragile?" I paused, my grip on his hands tightening. "I'm not made of glass. And neither is this. What's scarier to you? The idea of losing me as a friend, or the idea that what you felt in that moment might have been real?" A single tear escaped his eye and tracked down his cheek. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. I could see the answer in the raw, terrified vulnerability of his expression. He was afraid of the truth. He was afraid of the hope. And I realized, in that moment, that this was no longer about waiting for him. It was about being strong enough for both of us. It was about showing him that the world wouldn't end if he dared to feel something, that I wouldn't shatter, that we wouldn't shatter. I had been his harbor in the storm. Now, I had to be his lighthouse, the one fixed point of light to guide him home. In the profound, heavy silence that followed my question, the architecture of our relationship was rebuilt. The confrontation hadn't been a demolition. It had been a necessary excavation, clearing away the rubble of fear and misunderstanding to get to the bedrock of truth. Finn didn't offer a grand declaration. There was no sudden, cinematic epiphany. Instead, there was a quiet, fragile surrender. He just looked at me, his eyes full of a dawning, terrified recognition, and he squeezed my hands. It was a small gesture, but it was everything. It was an acknowledgement. It was an answer. It was the beginning of an exhale he had been holding in for a lifetime. We didn't talk much more that night. Words felt inadequate, clumsy tools for the delicate work we were doing. I moved from the floor to the sofa, sitting beside him, not touching, but close enough that he could feel my presence as a steady, unwavering warmth. We sat there for hours as the night deepened outside. The silence no longer a weapon of avoidance, but a space for healing, a shared quiet where he could finally stop running from himself. I could almost feel the frantic energy inside him slowly beginning to settle, the storm within him quieting to a gentle rain. He was exhausted, not just from swimming, but from the immense effort of holding himself together, of denying a fundamental part of who he was. And in my quiet, patient presence, he had finally found a place where he could let go. Eventually, his head drooped, his eyes fluttering closed. He listed sideways, just as he had that first night, and his head came to rest on my shoulder. This time, it was not an accident. It was a choice, a conscious, deliberate act of trust. I didn't freeze. I didn't overthink it. I simply wrapped an arm around his shoulders, pulling him closer, and rested my own head against his. He sighed, a deep, shuddering sound of release, and melted against me. He was home. We were home. We fell asleep like that, tangled together on the sofa, two broken pieces that, for the first time, seemed to fit together perfectly. The days that followed were a process of gentle, tentative rediscovery. We were learning a new language, one that included touch and shared glances that lingered with unspoken meaning. The closed door was a thing of the past. Now, he didn't just come to my room to escape his demons. He came to find me. The ritual of the night was transformed. There was no more pretense, no more careful distance. He would slide into my bed and immediately turn to me, wrapping an arm around my waist, pulling my back against his chest, his chin resting on my shoulder. We would lie there, cocooned in the darkness, and sometimes we would talk, whispering secrets to the shadows, about his fears, my hopes, our shared history. He told me about the immense pressure from his father, a former athlete who saw Finn's success as a reflection of his own. He confessed that he wasn't sure if he even loved swimming anymore, or if it was just something he did because it was all he had ever known. And I, in turn, began to share the parts of myself I had always kept hidden. I told him about the quiet loneliness that had been my constant companion before he came into my life. I showed him the secret collection of photographs I had taken of him over the years, the ones that captured his unguarded moments. I was terrified to show him, afraid he would see it as a creepy obsession, but he just looked through them with a quiet, reverent awe. He touched one of them, a shot of him laughing, his head thrown back in genuine, uncomplicated joy. "Is that how you see me?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "It's one of the ways," I told him. "I see all of you, Finn. The champion and the scared kid. The sunshine and the storm. I see all of it. And I'm not scared of any of it." Our new normal was built in these small, quiet moments of radical honesty. It was in the way he started holding my hand when we watched movies, his thumb tracing patterns on my palm. It was in the easy way I could now rest my head on his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. It was in our first real kiss, not born of desperation and confusion in the dark, but a slow, deliberate kiss in the soft morning light of the kitchen, tasting of coffee and the sweet, simple promise of a new day. Each act was a brick being laid in the foundation of our new reality, a reality that was stronger and more beautiful than the friendship it had grown from. He was still Finn, the athlete, the co-captain. He still trained, he still competed. But something had shifted in him. A great deal of the frantic, desperate energy was gone, replaced by a calmer, more centered focus. He was no longer swimming to prove something to his father or to the world. He was swimming for himself again. And when he stood on the starting block now, before a race, he would find my face in the crowd, and he would give me that small, conspiratorial smile, the one that had always been ours, but now it meant something more. It meant, "I see you." It meant, "You are my anchor." It meant, "We are in this together." There are moments in your life that are not about a world tilting on its axis, but about it finally, gently, clicking into place. They are not moments of grand drama, but of profound, quiet peace. They are the sound of two people breathing in the dark, not out of necessity, but out of choice. They are the comfortable weight of a head on a shoulder, no longer a transgression but a destination. For me, that peace arrived not in a single moment, but as a slow, rising tide, filling all the empty spaces inside me that I didn't even know were there. The boy who had inadvertently taught me how to hold my breath in his presence, waiting for a sign, a touch, a word, had become the boy who taught me how to breathe again, deeply and freely, in the beautiful, honest silence we had learned to create together. Our story wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was the slow, patient development of a photograph in a darkroom, an image that had been there all along, waiting for the right conditions to finally, breathtakingly, appear. And we had found our light.